What I'm about to tell you is going to make your blood boil, and if you're a gun owner who believed, even for a second, that this administration was somehow different, that they were actually going to be the most Second Amendment-friendly DOJ in history, then you need to sit down for this one. Because what just happened in federal court is nothing short of a complete and utter betrayal of every promise they made to you, to me, and to millions of Americans who voted based on those promises. The Department of Justice, your Department of Justice, just went into court and defended one of the most unconstitutional anti-Second Amendment laws ever written, the National Firearms Act of 1934. And they didn't just defend it. They defended it with the same tired, debunked arguments that gun grabbers have been using for nearly a century. If this doesn't wake you up to what's really happening behind closed doors in Washington, nothing will. But before we dive into this absolute train wreck of constitutional law, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because this is exactly the kind of breaking news that YouTube doesn't want you to see. And if you're not subscribed, you're going to miss these critical updates that could affect your rights as an American gun owner. So let me paint you a picture of what just went down, because the mainstream media sure as hell isn't going to tell you about it. We're talking about a federal court case where gun owners, real Americans who believe in the Constitution, challenge the National Firearms Act, specifically the portions that require you to pay a $200 tax stamp and wait months or even years just to exercise your constitutional right to own certain firearms. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with the NFA, let me break this down in terms that'll make you understand just how insidious this law really is. The National Firearms Act was passed in 1934 during the height of the Great Depression, when $200 was equivalent to about $4,000 in today's money. Think about that for a second. They literally priced poor people out of exercising their Second Amendment rights. This law requires you to pay this massive tax, submit to an extensive background check that goes far beyond what you'd face buying a regular firearm, provide fingerprints, get a photo taken like you're some kind of criminal, and then wait anywhere from 6 months to over a year for the government to graciously allow you to exercise a right that shall not be infringed. And what types of firearms are we talking about here? Short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, suppressors. You know, the things that Hollywood has convinced people are only used by assassins and criminals, but in reality are standard equipment for hunters, sport shooters, and anyone who cares about protecting their hearing while shooting. But here's where it gets really rich, and this is where you're going to start feeling that anger building up in your chest. This is the same DOJ that promised us they would be different. This is the same administration that campaigned on being pro-Second Amendment, that told us they understood the Constitution, that assured us they would respect our rights. And what do they do the moment they get the chance to actually stand up for those rights in court? They throw us under the bus faster than you can say shall not be infringed. The DOJ's lawyers, and these are supposed to be our lawyers, paid with our tax dollars, stood up in federal court and argued that the National Firearms Act is perfectly constitutional, that requiring Americans to pay thousands of dollars in taxes and wait over a year to exercise their rights is somehow reasonable, and that the government has every right to create these massive barriers between you and your constitutional rights. They essentially argued that the Second Amendment isn't really a right at all. It's a privilege that the government can regulate, tax, and restrict however they see fit. Now, I want you to think about this pattern for a minute, because this isn't the first time we've been betrayed like this. Remember when they promised us they wouldn't defend the ATF's bump stock ban? Remember when they said they understood that shall not be infringed means shall not be infringed? Remember when they told us that they would respect the rights of law-abiding gun owners and focus on actual criminals instead? Well, here we are, and not only are they defending every single anti-gun law on the books, they're actively arguing for expanding government power over gun owners. This isn't just about the NFA. This is about a fundamental betrayal of trust, a complete abandonment of the principles they campaigned on, and a clear signal that when push comes to shove, they will always choose government power over your individual rights. And the most infuriating part? They're doing it while still claiming to be pro-Second Amendment. They're literally gaslighting an entire community of gun owners, telling us that black is white and up is down, expecting us to just accept their word over our own eyes. The pattern here is clear as day, and it's been building for months now. First, it was the continued defense of the ATF's arbitrary and capricious rulemaking process. Then it was the refusal to challenge clearly unconstitutional state laws that were being passed left and right. Then we saw them defending the background check system expansions, the red flag laws, and now this, the full-throated defense of one of the most egregious violations of the Second Amendment ever codified into law. Each time, they give us the same excuses. We have to defend the law as it exists, or we're just doing our job, or my personal favorite, this doesn't mean we agree with the law. We're just defending it. But here's the thing they don't want you to understand. The DOJ has discretion. They can choose which laws to defend and which ones to let fall. They can choose to argue that a law is unconstitutional. They can choose to take a position that actually aligns with the Constitution and the rights of American citizens. But they're not doing that. Instead, they're choosing to be the tip of the spear for gun control advocates, using your tax dollars to pay lawyers to argue against your rights in federal court. So, what exactly did the DOJ argue in this case? Well, buckle up, because their legal reasoning is going to make you want to throw something at the wall. First, they argued, and I'm not making this up, that the $200 tax stamp isn't really a burden on Second Amendment rights because, and I quote, "The tax is not prohibitively expensive for most Americans." Think about the arrogance of that statement for a minute. These are people who make six-figure salaries, who have government health insurance, who will retire with full pensions. Telling working-class Americans that a $200 tax plus the cost of the firearm plus the cost of legal fees plus the opportunity cost of waiting over a year isn't a burden. They're essentially saying that if you can't afford to pay what amounts to a poll tax on your constitutional rights, then maybe those rights aren't for you. This is the same logic that was used to justify poll taxes in the Jim Crow South, and now they're applying it to the Second Amendment with a straight face. But it gets worse. The DOJ also argued that the extensive background check and registration requirements are justified because firearms covered under the NFA are particularly dangerous. Now let's unpack this piece of legal brilliance. A short-barreled rifle, which is literally just a regular rifle with a barrel that's 15.9 inches instead of 16 inches, is somehow particularly dangerous in a way that justifies stripping you of your constitutional rights. A suppressor, a safety device that protects your hearing and reduces noise pollution, is particularly dangerous despite being completely legal and unregulated in many countries with much stricter gun laws than ours. The DOJ is literally arguing that physics works differently when a barrel is 15.9 inches versus 16 inches, that a bullet somehow becomes more lethal when fired from a slightly shorter barrel. This isn't just bad legal reasoning. It's insulting to anyone with a basic understanding of firearms and ballistics. Then there's their argument about the registration requirement, and this one should terrify every gun owner in America. The DOJ argued that requiring gun owners to register NFA items with the federal government doesn't violate any constitutional rights because, wait for it, the government promises not to use that information to confiscate firearms. I'll give you a moment to let that sink in. They're asking you to trust the same government that has repeatedly lied to gun owners, that has used registration lists for confiscation in other countries, that has expanded every gun control law beyond its original scope, to just take their word that they won't abuse this power. This is the same government that told us the Brady Act would only apply to licensed dealers until they tried to expand it to private sales. This is the same government that told us that background checks wouldn't be used to create a registry until we found out they were keeping records for decades. And now they want us to trust them with a literal registry of some of the most regulated firearms in the country. But perhaps the most insulting argument the DOJ made was their claim that the NFA doesn't really infringe on Second Amendment rights because you can still buy these items. You just have to jump through a few hoops first. This is like saying that requiring you to pay a tax, get government permission, and wait a year before you can speak freely doesn't violate the First Amendment because you can still speak. You just have to get approval first. This is like saying that requiring you to pay a fee and get a permit before you can practice your religion doesn't violate religious freedom because you can still worship. You just need government permission first. The fundamental dishonesty of this argument is staggering, and the fact that it's coming from DOJ lawyers who supposedly took an oath to defend the Constitution makes it even more outrageous. Now, let's talk about what this really means for you as a gun owner, because this goes far beyond just NFA items. When the DOJ argues that the government can impose massive taxes, extensive delays, and registration requirements on firearms as long as they don't completely ban them, they're setting a precedent that can be applied to every firearm in America. If a $200 tax and a year-long wait is constitutional for an NFA item, what's to stop them from applying the same logic to handguns? To semi-automatic rifles? To ammunition? The DOJ's argument in this case essentially guts the Second Amendment by saying that any government regulation is acceptable as long as it doesn't amount to a complete ban. This is the same logic that gun control advocates have been pushing for decades: death by 1,000 cuts, making gun ownership so expensive, so time-consuming, so bureaucratically burdensome that people simply give up on exercising their rights. And here's what really gets me fired up about this whole situation. They think you're stupid. They think they can campaign on being pro-Second Amendment, then turn around and defend every anti-gun law on the books, and you'll just accept it because they use fancy legal language and bureaucratic doublespeak. They think they can gaslight an entire community of gun owners by telling us that defending unconstitutional laws is somehow different from supporting those laws. But we're not stupid, and we can see exactly what's happening here. When you voluntarily go into court and argue that a law is constitutional, when you spend taxpayer money hiring lawyers to defend that law, when you fight tooth and nail to preserve that law against constitutional challenges, you are supporting that law. There's no daylight between defending the NFA and supporting the NFA, no matter how much they want to pretend otherwise. The gaslighting here is particularly insidious because it's designed to make you question your own perceptions and reactions. When you get angry about the DOJ defending anti-gun laws, they'll tell you that you're overreacting, that this is just standard government practice, that it doesn't mean anything. When you point out that their actions contradict their promises, they'll tell you that you're misunderstanding the legal process, that defense doesn't equal endorsement. But here's the truth they don't want you to understand. When the DOJ chooses to defend a law, they are making a policy choice. They're deciding that preserving that law is more important than respecting your constitutional rights. They are choosing government power over individual liberty, and they're doing it with your tax dollars while lying to your face about their commitment to the Second Amendment. This pattern of gaslighting extends beyond just this one case. Look at how they've handled every major Second Amendment issue that's come up. When gun owners expressed concern about ATF overreach, they told us we were paranoid conspiracy theorists. When we pointed out that their policies were indistinguishable from those of previous anti-gun administrations, they told us we were being unfair and not giving them a chance. When we questioned why they weren't challenging clearly unconstitutional state laws, they told us that federalism meant they had to respect state sovereignty, but somehow that respect for state sovereignty disappears when states pass pro-gun laws. The double standards are so blatant, so obvious, that it's insulting to anyone paying attention. But the most damaging part of this gaslighting campaign is how it's designed to divide the gun rights community. They know that some gun owners will accept these explanations, will convince themselves that this administration is somehow different, will continue to support politicians who promise one thing and deliver another. They're counting on that division, on gun owners fighting among themselves instead of holding their elected officials accountable. They want us to be confused, to be uncertain about what's really happening, to second-guess our own observations and experiences. Because a divided, confused gun rights community is much easier to defeat than a united one that sees clearly what's happening. So what happens next? Well, the immediate question is how the court will rule on this case, and frankly, given the DOJ's arguments, I'm not optimistic. When the government's own lawyers are arguing against constitutional rights, when they're providing the court with legal cover to uphold unconstitutional laws, it makes it much harder for plaintiffs to win these cases. The DOJ's position gives judges who might be inclined to uphold gun control laws all the ammunition they need to dismiss constitutional challenges. This is the real damage of the DOJ's betrayal. it's not just about this one case. It's about setting precedent that will make it harder to challenge unconstitutional gun laws for years to come. But beyond this specific case, we need to be prepared for what's coming next. If the DOJ is willing to defend the NFA this aggressively, what other anti-gun laws are they going to defend? What about challenges to assault weapon bans? What about magazine capacity restrictions? What about universal background check laws? Based on their arguments in this case, there's no anti-gun law too extreme for them to defend. They've essentially adopted the position that any gun regulation is constitutional as long as it doesn't amount to a complete ban, which means there's virtually no limit to what they'll support in court. We also need to be watching for new regulatory actions from the ATF, because the DOJ's willingness to defend existing anti-gun laws in court suggests they'll be equally willing to defend new ones. Don't be surprised if we see more arbitrary rule changes, more attempts to reclassify common firearms as NFA items, more bureaucratic obstacles thrown in the path of law-abiding gun owners. The DOJ's legal position in this case essentially gives the ATF carte blanche to regulate whatever they want however they want, secure in the knowledge that DOJ lawyers will defend their actions in court. And here's what I need you to understand about the bigger picture. This isn't just about guns. When the government can impose massive taxes and year-long delays on the exercise of constitutional rights, when they can require registration and government permission for fundamental liberties, when they can price people out of exercising their rights and call it constitutional, they're not just attacking the Second Amendment. They're attacking the entire concept of constitutional rights as limitations on government power. Today, it's a $200 tax on firearms. Tomorrow, it could be a $200 tax on political speech, or religious practice, or any other right they want to discourage. So here's what you need to do right now. First, you need to understand that this administration's promises about being pro-Second Amendment were lies, pure and simple. Their actions in court speak louder than their campaign rhetoric, and their actions show a complete disregard for your constitutional rights. Second, you need to hold them accountable. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking that defending anti-gun laws doesn't count as supporting anti-gun laws. Don't let them convince you that their betrayal is somehow acceptable because they use the right talking points in public. Third, you need to support the organizations and legal challenges that are actually fighting for your rights, because clearly the DOJ isn't going to do it. Most importantly, you need to stay informed and stay engaged, because they're counting on you to lose interest, to get distracted, to assume that someone else is looking out for your rights. That's why you need to subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with every gun owner you know. Because the mainstream media isn't going to tell you about cases like this, and if we don't get the word out, most gun owners will never know how badly they're being betrayed by the people they trusted to protect their rights. The DOJ may have chosen to gaslight gun owners and defend unconstitutional laws, but we don't have to accept it quietly. We can fight back, we can hold them accountable, and we can make sure that every gun owner in America knows exactly where this administration really stands on the Second Amendment. Thanks for watching, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next one.